Welcome to Lesson 25 in Through the New Testament in Ancient Greek for Absolute Beginners. My name is Helena Stay, and I'm your guide as we read through the New Testament in its original, beautiful language, the language of ancient Greece, which coincidentally was called Helleniste. Because each lesson builds on previous lessons, be sure to start with Lesson 1. And please don't forget to like this video and to subscribe to my channel if you feel so led. Let's get started. In this lesson, we'll read through Matthew 11, verses 1 through 19, which covers John the Baptist's inquiry about Jesus and Jesus testifying about John. And we're mainly going to focus on verbs. Last lesson, which was 23.5, we focused on nouns. So let's go back and review our verb forms. We have some verbs we've already covered, and we haven't covered a few other types of verbs, but let's review before we move on. So we'll review participles, both present and past participles, and then we'll review present indicative active and present indicative middle and passive. We'll also review infinitives and the conjugation of the word to be or εἰμί in Greek in the present indicative. We'll also talk about εἰμί in the future indicative as well as the aorist indicative. And then we'll review the third person imperative and the other imperative forms. And in the last 2 or 3 verses of Matthew 11, 1 through 19, we'll look at a few more verbs. All right, let's get started. So let's read Matthew 11, verses 1 through 3. Kai egeneto hate etelesen ha Jesus, diatason tois dodeka mathetais autou. Metebe ekathen tu didaskein, kai kerusein en tais polisin auton. Ha de Ioannes acusas ento desmoterio ta erga tu Christu, pempsas dia ton matheton autou. Apen auto. Su ha erkomenos heteron prostokomen. So before we review our specific verb forms, let's look at all of the forms so we can kind of get an overhead perspective and then zero in on the parts that we'll talk about. Today we'll be talking about participles, which are over here. We're also going to be talking about the present tense, a little bit about the aorist tense, especially when it comes to infinitives. We'll talk about present and aorist. And then we'll also talk about a little bit having to do with the, well, there's going to be some future verbs, but we're not really going to focus on them. We'll mainly be in the indicative mood. So we'll talk about the indicative mood, the infinitive mood, and the participle mood, and then we'll also talk about the imperative when you want somebody to do something. So let me just focus on the overview. So we have both tenses and moods, and I also put non-finite verb forms in here, as well as voice. So our tenses are present, imperfect, aorist, future, perfect, and pluperfect. And notice we had to use the R in perfect and the L in pluperfect because P had already been taken by present. So I like to remember this as P.I-A-FR-L, 6 different tenses. And now not all moods have all of these tenses, but the indicative mood, the one that kind of describes objective reality, does have all these tenses. So that's the one with all 6. And then we also have several other moods. Now, indicative describes your objective reality, like your day-to-day experience. Now, when something's hypothetical and might happen, it's called the subjunctive. And this is much more common in ancient Greek than it is in English. And then we have optative, which is not very common, but whenever you say, so might it be done, or may it be as you say, that is kind of an example of optative. Then we have imperative mood, which is when you want to have somebody do something. So go or stay or come back. Those are all commands. And in Greek, they do have a third person. So in English, we don't really have a third person imperative, but we'll talk about that today. Infinitives are like verbal nouns. So the to be here is like a noun, to be a parent. That's something that is wonderful to be. And so usually in English, we have the word to, and then we have the infinitive form. And you'll see in Greek, there's some endings that will identify the infinitive for us, I and ein. And then the participles here in peach are like verbal adjectives, where as infinitives are verbal nouns, the participles are verbal adjectives, like being, having been. This would be an example of a present participle. And then in English, we use this having and then the past participle to use the past participle form. So being a teacher, having been a teacher, those are all examples of a verbal adjective. And here these verbal adjectives are being used as nouns, so they're called a substantive use of the adjective. So without getting into too much detail, we'll go into that a little more later. And then within all of the tenses, you will generally see that you have an active tense where the subject is doing the action, a middle tense where the subject is performing an action on itself, or for certain types of verbs where it's very subject oriented. The subject is moving itself, like I go is kind of a subject oriented. Subject is moving itself, so this will be in the middle tense in Greek. And then you have the passive tense where the subject is the object of the verb. So an example, I save money. I is the subject, money is the object, and save is what you're doing to the object. And in this case, this is transitive because there is a direct object. I save money. Whereas if you want to say I save myself, like if I go swimming and I start drowning, I don't need anybody to help me. I save myself. Unfortunately, a lot of people do that when it comes to religion. But I save myself would be in the middle tense because it's something that the subject is doing to itself. And then finally, passive is when you are saved by someone else. So that would be the subject being saved by Jesus, for example. All right, so let's go ahead and zero in on some of these verbs. So speaking of participles, we have a few examples in these first two verses. Generally, when you see a participle in the nominative, you'll see this omega nu at the end, own. And it's not always the case because you also have that with the genitive plural noun endings, but generally the own will indicate the present participle. Another thing you'll notice with participles is this usas ending, and that's going to be when you have an aorist participle, usas, but you'll see as we go into more forms. Here's another one with sas at the end, and now this psi here is a combination of the pi from pempo with sigma, and the sigma is added when it's aorist. Here this A is for aorist. So this together will become simply the one form, which you don't need two letters for, just the psi, so psas here. And then menos. Now men here is an indication of middle. Now, I've heard one professor, Rob Plummer from Baylor, he likes to say the men always like to sit in the middle of the pews, not doing their part. So that's to help you remember that this is the middle form of the present participle for a verb. In this case, it's erkomai, which means to come or to go. And this is the one who is coming. So are you the one is coming, basically the Messiah? All right, so let's look at this a little bit longer. We have Jesus commanding the 12 disciples. Diatasso with this own is kind of like the ing. The own is kind of like the ing in commanding. So in this case, he had finished commanding the disciples. What had he finished? He finished commanding. So this is kind of like a noun. This is the object of the verb finished. So diatasson. Here, the participle is used as almost like a clause to indicate timing. John had already heard. So having heard about Jesus's works in prison, akousas. That's why we have an aorist participle. It kind of indicates that this action, the hearing, happened first before he sent out the disciples. And then again, having sent two disciples of his, like so these are John's disciples, pempsas. So akousas, having heard, pempsas, having sent. And this is helpful because they're all nominative masculine singular. So that gives you an idea of the basic forms of those participles. It gets a little bit more complicated once it changes the case. So having sent two disciples, said to him, are you the one that is coming, or should we look for another one? All right, so the coming one, erkomenos. In this case, the coming one here, this is actually substantive use, and I'll write that down here. So substantive use, I don't know why it's not working thicker, but of an adjectival participle is like a noun, the coming one. So substantive, the coming one, instead of the ha erchomenos anthropos, for example, would be the coming man. But in this case, ha erchomenos by itself is a substantive noun. Are you the one who is coming? Let's look at all of the forms of the present participles. So we saw already the luon. So own is kind of like ing in English, but unfortunately they have like lots of forms of ing in ancient Greek. But there's a common format, and you will recognize the pattern over as you read words over and over. So we have luon, which means loosing. So luo is our main adjective. I didn't put the lexical form, luo. So I loose, luo. Luon. So we have luon, luontos, luonti, luonta. And then notice when you have neuter, these are going to be the same. So I'll get to that soon enough. And then you have luontes for the nominative plural, luontone. You have the own ending here, but notice this is for genitive. So just remember genitive plural is a little bit, it's similar, but it's not because of, the own is indicating genitive plural, not the nominative singular. Luusin, luontas. And notice this new in parentheses, this is a movable new, and it doesn't have to be there. Most of the time it is there, but it doesn't have to be. All right, in the feminine, we have a little bit of a change with the, instead of own, you have usa. Usa is a little more feminine than own. Luusa, and then luuses, luuse, with our little iota subscript. Luusan, luusai, luuson, luusais, luusas. All right, so it's similar to our alpha pattern in the first declension nouns. All right, and then neuter is very similar to our masculine, except instead of luon, it's luon. And then luontas, same, luonti, luon. And remember, neuter, nominative, and accusative are the same. Luonta, which is a little bit different, but we have that ah, which is typical of neuter plural. Luontone, same as the masculine. Luusin, and luonta. So the patterns I've put in the same colors here, and it should help a little bit. All right, now let's talk about words that are in the passive or middle. Like here, this would be loosing myself. And note in present participles, there's only one form for both the middle and the passive, which is nice. And remember that men sitting in the middle of the pew, not doing their part. So men will indicate to you that this is a present participle, middle or passive. All right, so luamenos, luamenu, luameno, luamenon, luamenoi, luamenon, luamenois, luamenus, luamene, luamenes, luamene, luamenane, luamenai, luamenon, luamenais, luamenas, luamenon, luamenu, luameno, luamenon, luamena, luamenon, luamenois, luamena. Again, the same patterns. Neuter and masculine are the same in the genitive and dative, both singular and plural. And then we have the same neuters, singular, nominative and accusative, and plural, nominative and accusative. And then the cool thing is here we have the same form for all genders in the genitive plural. All right, and don't worry about memorizing these. This is just something you'll recognize as we go through the Bible. You'll see more and more examples. All right, so I just want to come back to what we saw earlier and point out again, remember the own is for the nominative masculine singular present participle active voice. Diatason, commanding, finished commanding. Akusas is our nominative masculine singular for akuo. Now this is the aorist. We didn't really talk about the aorist, but the difference between the aorist and the present participle is the place and time. This happened before. So the ending is going to be a little different. Notably, you're going to have this sigma here that will indicate that it's an aorist, and then you have different endings. Again, this one's aorist, having sent, and then erkomenos, the one who's coming. So that is the men morphing there. The men will indicate that it is a present participle, but it's middle and passive. All right, let's go ahead and read Matthew chapter 11, verses 4 through 6. Kai apokrithes ha Jesus epen autois, poreuthentes, apangelate, Ioane, ha akuete, kai blepete. Tufloi anablepusin, kai koloi peripatusin, leproi katharisantai, kai kofoi akuusin, kai nekroi egeirantai, kai petokoi euangelisantai, kai makarias estin has eon me scandalisthe en emoi. All right, lots of great verbs here. So what I want to show you in this slide are all of the present indicative active forms. So you'll see here, and not just active, here we have a middle passive down here. Okay, so we have primarily P.I.A., see right here, P.I.A., P.I.A., P.I.A. Here we have a middle passive, cleansed. They are cleansed. That's passive. They aren't cleansing, they're cleansed. P.I.A. again, P.I.M. up here. Here's are raised. So they're not raising, they're being raised. And these are gospelized, basically evangelized. The good news is being preached to them. So that's again passive. And those are the main ones. So let's look at akuete. This is from akuo, which means to listen or you hear. So tell John what you hear and see. You, plural, second person plural, akuete. Blepete, this comes from blepo, which means to look at. And so we have the ete ending. And we take off this, the omega is for the first person singular. And so you're left with blep and then add ete. And then we have anablepusin. So here, receive sight, to receive sight is anablepo. Blepo is to look at, and anablepo is to recover sight, receive sight. The lame walk, this comes from peripateo. This is what's called a contract verb because you have this epsilon before the omega. Instead of saying peripato, it's peripateo. And that's why we have this lengthened vowel here. So instead of usin, it's oosin. All right, peripatusin. And then to be cleansed is, well, to cleanse is katharizo. So you just take this and add the passive endings, antai, which is third person plural, katharisantai. And then akuusin. Here we have second person plural, and here we have the third person plural endings, akuusin. And then are raised is similar to katharisantai. It's egeirantai, from egeiro, to raise up. All right, and then we have euangelisantai, which is from euangeliso. We take off this omega and we add antai for our third person plural passive endings. All right, let me give you a little bit of an overview of these various forms. So we have our favorite simple verb, luo, is I loose. So we're going to start with luo, lues, lue. That means I loose, you loose, he or she or it looses. Luamen, luete, luusin. So you recognize usin from our previous slide, and you recognize the ete from our previous slide. And then we have the word echo, which means I have. So just to show you how it's the same, echo, ekes, eke. Ekamen, ekete, ekusin. So we have the same endings there. All right, let's look at our present indicative passive voice. We add amai, luamai, lue with our little iota subscript, luatai, luamatha, luesthe, and luantai. Now this you should recognize from the previous slide. We had some antai examples with are cleansed, are raised, are being evangelized. Erkamai is our lexical form. You just take off the omai part and replace it with etai, amatha, este, antai. All right, so those are going to become more and more familiar to you as we go along. But erkamai, erke, erkatai, erkamatha, erkeste, erkantai. All right, let's go back and look at these again. Akuete, we recognize the ete, and also blepete and the ete. And then we have usin, a little bit longer because it is this contract verb. Katharisantai, who have antai, showing that it's passive. And then akuusin, which is the same as akuete, but with the third person plural. Egeirantai, again, antai indicates that it's passive, or that it's a passive or middle-only verb like erkamai. And then euangelisantai also has this antai for the passive. All right, let's go ahead and read Matthew chapter 11, verses 7 through 9. Touton de por menon erxato ha Jesus, legein tois achlois peri Ioannu. Ti ex eilthate eistain eireman theasasthai. Kalaman hupa anemu saluamenan. Allah ti ex eilthate edain. Anthropon en malakois emphiesmenon idu hoi ta malaka foruntes en tois oikois ton basileon esin. Allah ti ex eilthate prophetein edain? Nay, lego humin kai perisateran prophetu. All right, in this slide I want to talk about infinitives, which are our verbal nouns. In English we would say to say. In fact, you have it right here. Lego is to say in English, although the literal translation of Lego is I say. But in English, usually in the dictionary, we would just have the infinitive to say, whereas in Greek, the lexical form is used, which is the first person singular, present indicative active. All right, and then we also have theaomai and horao here. So Jesus, now as these were going away now, Jesus, ha Jesus, erxato, began, what did he begin to do? To speak. So this is basically the object of began. So legein comes from lego. And basically you just take the omega off of the first person singular and you add ein, epsilon, iota, nu, to the crowds concerning John. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? So this is the object of going out. Basically, go out to see. We do this in English too. This is kind of a compound verb where you are having, they went out to do something, they went out to see. All right, so in English it's exact same form, so it's not too difficult for you. To see, they asasthai, and the indication here is sasthai. That's an aorist infinitive, and notice the n is used for infinitive. Aorist infinitive middle. All right, and this is interesting because theasomai is one of those middle only verbs. You can tell because it's the lexical form ends with omai instead of omega. All right, let's go down here. And again, what did you go out to see? Edain. Notice it's a different form of see. In theaomai, it's more like to look upon, to behold. This is where we get theater. So it's a little bit more like to stare at something and admire it, or to look at it for a while. Whereas edain comes from horao, and that means to see, perceive, attend to. So it's very similar, but I think Matthew is just using a different kind of form of very similar idea here. And then again down here, did you go out to see a prophet? Edain. And notice this little indication here of the double arrow, and sometimes the manuscripts have it in the opposite order. All right, so let's go ahead and look at these infinitive forms. So we have two different tenses for infinitives. We have present tense and we have the aorist tense. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about how these differ, except to say that generally you'll have the present tense infinitive when it's an ongoing action. Like when you want to say, I want to be walking right now. To be walking is kind of ongoing. That's when you would use the present infinitive. But if it's something general, like I want to walk, like in general, I like to walk, that would be more of an aorist type of idea. So without going into too much detail there, I just want to kind of give you an example in English. I want to be walking versus I like to walk. All right, so luain is our active infinitive present. So we have the epsilon iota nu. And then in the middle passive, to be loosed, like I want to be loosed, would be luesthai. So we have esthai. And then for something like poryuomai or erkamai or theaomai, you would have esthai also, right? So those two forms are the same. You just basically have one meaning middle passive, and then this one is for middle only verbs. Poryuesthai, to go. I want to go, you would say poryuesthai bulamai, I want to go. And then aorist, we have a lot of forms here. So the important thing to notice is you have these sigmas and thetas. So the active is loosai. So to loose is wonderful, something like that. You would say loosai, loosai. And then for to loose oneself, you would say loosasthai, loosasthai. And then to be loosed, like I want to be loosed, you would say luthenai, luthenai. And a lot of times thetas are used for passive. Not always when you see a theta is it passive, but a lot of times if you notice this is luo, you're going to say, oh, this is some sort of passive. And the I at the end will indicate an infinitive. And then middle only middle form, so like a middle only verb like poryuomai or erkamai, you have sasthai. Notice up here we have esthai and it becomes sasthai. So you have the sigma alpha, which is often a sign of the aorist, poryusasthai. And then the passive form of a middle only verb is poryuthenai. Notice how these are the same. This one here is the same as this one here. And then this one here is the same as this one here. So whether it's a verb being used like to do something to oneself or to be loosed, you use the exact same form for these middle only verbs. So loosasthai, poryusasthai, luthenai, poryuthenai. And these guys, just to make life more interesting, are pretty much interchangeable, right? So you can say poryusasthai and poryuthenai, and they mean pretty much the same thing. So, but don't worry about memorizing this. Over time, we will be seeing these forms over and over, and it'll become easier to recognize them. All right, so back to what we were seeing before, I just wanted to say Jesus began to speak. So we have, remember, our ein for the present infinitive, active, and then we have sasthai, theasasthai. That is from a middle only verb, to see, and it is the aorist. What did you, when you went out to the wilderness to see, what did you do to go to see? And this is more of a simple, like, one-time thing. So that's why we have aorist. It's much more succinct, like a single action as opposed to like a ongoing action. So here it's a little confusing because this is aorist and it has the same endings as the present infinitive here. Now I'm just going to introduce this idea to you, but this is what's called a second aorist. It's an irregular aorist tense, and it's called second aorist because it's irregular, but it also is interesting because it will take the present tense forms. So even though it's aorist, you'll see these present endings. So just remember, second aorist takes present endings. Second aorist takes present endings. It'll make more sense in the future, but I like to remember that. So edain is an example of second aorist. It's very different from horao. It has this stem id instead of hor. So it's definitely, it's going to be taking those present endings because it's second aorist. And again, it's edain, to see. All right, let's go ahead and continue on with our Matthew chapter 11, verses 10 through 15. Hutas estin peri hu gegraptai, idu ego apostello ton angelon mu, pra prosopu su, Has kataskuase tein hadan su emprosthen su. Amen legu humin, uk egegertai, en genetois gunaikon meson Ioanno tu baptistu. Hade mikrateras en te basileia ton uranon, meson autu estin. Apade ton hemeron Ioannou tu baptistu, heos arti, he basileia ton uranon biazetai, kai biastai harpazusin autein. Panteskar hoi prophetai, kai hanamas heos Ioannou, e prophetusan, kai thelete dexasthai autas estin Elias, ha melon erkesthai, ha ekon ota akueto. All right, in this slide, I want to just point out the third person singular form of the verb eİmī, which means I am. In the third person, it's he, she, or it is. I also want to point out a third person imperative, and then we'll go into eİmī's conjugation and the imperative in general. But notice the third person imperative it does exist in ancient Greek, but not in English. In English, we only have second person. All right, for this is concerning whom it has been written. This is estin, that is present indicative active third person singular of eİmī. Again, here, he is greater, right? So this is talking about how John the Baptist is the greatest of all people born of women. Basically, on this earth, John the Baptist is the greatest. But the very least in the kingdom of heavens, or the kingdom of God, is greater than John the Baptist. So greater than he is, estin. And then again, he is Elijah. All right, so he is Elijah, talking about John the Baptist being the Elijah come again. Autos estin Elias. All right, so that's our estin, which you'll probably recognize more and more. I also want to say let him hear. So in English, we have to say let him hear. And this let is kind of a weird forming, because it almost makes it sound like it should be like you're allowing somebody to do something. But in ancient Greek, akueto is basically like a command. That person hear. Whereas we usually say hear to someone directly, like a second person, like hear me, listen to me. But let that person hear is kind of the way we would say it in English, but in Greek they just have one form for that third person command. All right, so let's go through these real quick. These are the forms of eİmī, and I have present, future, and imperfect. So the imperfect is when something goes on in the past, and we don't have an aorist tense of to be because it's more of an ongoing type of verb. So you're only going to really see this imperfect, something that's kind of ongoing in the past. Oh, another thing is we won't have a passive voice of eİmī. The verb to be you can't really have passive. So it's kind of nice. You don't have to worry about aorist, you don't have to worry about passive. So eİmī is I am, and then it's estin, we saw that in the previous verses on the previous slide. Esmen, este, esin. All right, and then we have our future. Now, future will generally have this sigma, and these endings should be very similar to what we've seen with our middle-only verbs and our passive. Essomai, esse, estai, esametha, essesthe, essantai. All right, so amai, what's usually etai, but here with estai, amatha, este, antai. Those should be very familiar in terms of the present tense passive. All right, and then we have the imperfect of eİmī, which again, there's no aorist of eİmī, thank goodness. We have amain, ace, and sometimes you'll have aestha, ain, amen, or ametha, ate, ason. All right, so you'll see those more and more. Again, please don't stress out. There's just so many times we'll be seeing these in the future, so don't think you need to know them right away. All right, and our imperative. Cool thing about imperative, I always try to emphasize the benefits. We don't have a first person imperative, so it's a little easier. But we have our present tense. This should be an M, so I apologize. That's not an infinitive. It should be PMA, AMA, PMMP. All right, so let's go ahead and just read these. Don't worry about remembering them, but you'll see some commonalities here. Second person. So if you want somebody to loose the horse, you would say lue. If it's plural, you would say luete. You all loose the horse. And then let him loose the horse is lueto, lueto. And then lueto-san, lueto-san. All right, and then here, aorist tense. Now this is usually, present tense is something that you do. You tell people to do something in general, like be a good person or give to the poor. That give would be more of a present tense idea. Aorist is like a quick thing, like drop the ball or stop the car, that kind of thing. So these are used for that type of a situation. Lusan, lusato, lusete, and lusato-san. Notice these are very similar, except you have the sigma and you have an alpha. So instead of lueto, it's lusato. Interesting. Instead of lueto-san, you have lusato-san. And then this one is exactly the same, except it has the sigma. Luete, lucete. So loose, in general, you should loose your horses when it's cold out or something like that. That would be luete. But if you want to do it now, right away, loose the horse right now, it would be lucete. So that's a very big generalization, but I'm kind of giving you an idea of why there's a little difference between these two different types of commands. All right, and then if we're doing present tense imperative middle passive, be loosed, you would say luon. So it goes from lue to luon. And then luesto, instead of lueto, you have luesto. So notice instead of the tau, you have the sigma theta, luesto. Instead of luete, you have lueste. Again, instead of the tau, you have the sigma theta. And then instead of lueto-san, you have luesto-san, be loosed, or let them be loosed. All right, and then we will look at the passive voice. Instead of the sigma, you now have the theta, eta, lutheti, lutheto, luthete, and lutheto-san. So notice how this sigma goes away, and we have a thete instead of sete, thete, and then instead of sato-san, it's theto-san. Now, don't worry, these are obviously going to be very confusing when you first hear them, but I just want to give you an overview of all the different ways you can tell somebody what to do in ancient Greek. So now let's look at PM. Remember, this should be an M. Middle passive for a middle only verb, like por you am I, to go. Por you on. Notice this is the exact same. Por you on. Luon, por you on. Por you estho. So lu estho, por you estho. So very, very easy. Lu este, por you este. Lu estho-san. This should be por you estho-san. So por you estho-san. And then over here we have our AMA, so our first aorist, and I'm going to say first aorist because there's a lot of irregular second aorists that don't fall into this form. Por usai, notice we have, it's similar but not quite the same as up here. Por usai, por usaste, and then por usasto and por usasto-san. This is very similar. So luesto, por usasto, and luesto-san, por usasto-san for the aorist. And again, in present versus aorist imperatives, usually it has to do with kind of the type of verb you're talking about, whether it's something that's ongoing or something that's quick. All right, so pointing these out again, I just want to, so estin is our third person singular of eİmī. And then here's our third person singular of akuo, let him hear, akueto, akueto. All right, here are our last verses for this lesson. Matthew 11, verses 16 through 19. Tinide hamoioso tein genean tautein. Hamoia estin paidiois kathemenois entais agorais. Ha prosphonunta tois heterois. Legusin huleisamen humin kai uk horkeisaste. efreithnesamen kai uk ekapsasde. Eilthengar Ioannes meite estheon meite pinon kai legusin daimonion eke. Eilthen hahuias tu anthropou estheon kai pinon kai legusin idu anthropos phagas kai oinapates telonon philos kai hamartolon kai edikai othe he sophia apaton ergon e autes. All right, so let's just cover a few more verbs here before we end. I just wanted to review a few things we've seen. We've seen esteem, third person singular of your present indicative active form of εἰμί. It is like children. So this generation is like children sitting in the markets. Here is kathemenois. That comes from kathemai. This is a middle only verb, sitting. So it's kind of a subject related action. The person that's doing it isn't doing it to something else. They're seating themselves. So that's why it's kind of a middle only verb. Kathemenois. Remember, men indicates that it's the men that are passive and sitting in the middle of the pews, not doing their part. Thank you, Rob Plummer. We have a present participle, that's middle passive, in the dative plural. That's why we have the ois at the end. Kathemenois. All right, and calling out, prosphonunta. This is our present participle, active, nominative, neuter plural. So this is modifying the children, which are neuter, and they're calling out to others. Saying, in this case, we're using, the translator is using present participle in English, but you could say they say, because it's the present indicative active, third person plural. They say, and notice our legusin from Lego. We piped for you, didn't dance, you didn't wail when we sang a dirge. All right, eilthen. I really want to point out this verb. We see it a few times here. Eilthen is the aorist. This is a second aorist because it's not regular. Erkamai in its aorist tense in the past is eilthen. You'll see it down here also, eilthen. All right, and then eating, estheon, comes from, here we have estheo, to eat. And notice this own is kind of like our English ing, or it's our present participle active nominative masculine singular. They were neither eating. So John the Baptist wasn't eating and he wasn't drinking. He was just eating those crickets, as you recall, or locusts and honey. He wasn't drinking, definitely not wine. And they said he had a demon, or has a demon. Eke. Legusin, again, we have third person plural of Lego. And then the Son of Man came, eating and drinking, and they said that he was a friend of sinners and a glutton and a drunkard. So basically they're saying, they're criticizing people for doing the exact same thing, or doing the opposite. There's no right way for this generation. They don't want to believe no matter what you say, whether it's John the Baptist not eating and not drinking, or Jesus both eating and drinking, they're always going to find fault. All right, so let's go ahead and look at this one last time just to remind you of this ending: on, ontas, onti, onta, ontes, onton, usin, ontas, usa, uses, use, usan, usai, uson, usais, usas. And then on, ontas, onti, on, onta, onton, usin, onta. And then the passive, middle and passive, is omenos, omenu, omeno, omenon, omenoi, amenon, amenois, amenus, amene, amenes, amene, amenain, amenai, amenon, amenais, amenas, amenon, amenu, ameno, amenon, amena, amenon, amenois, amena. All right, so again, those are our present participles, active voice and middle and passive voice. That brings us to the end of this lesson. Thank you for hanging in there with me. We covered a lot of forms. Again, don't worry if it's not clicking for you. It takes a lot of reading, and we're just starting out. So hang in there, keep following along with me, and everything will start clicking in your mind, and you will be blessed, I pray, as you go through the New Testament with me. Talk to you soon.